Welcome to ICN Sunday Morning. I'm Vernon Loeb, Executive Editor. I've asked Dan Gearino to join me this morning to talk about President Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill and EVs, electric vehicles. The bill is massive and sort of massively distressing to those of us who care about climate change, particularly in the way it deals with the EV tax credit. Dan is our chief renewables writer, and he really knows his stuff when it comes to EVs. In fact, last year, Dan wrote an entire series called Politically Charged, which looked at the politics of EVs during the presidential election. Dan, thanks so much for joining me this morning.
Glad to be here.
So the Trump bill eliminates the $7,500 tax credit on new EVs and the $4,000 a year tax credit on used EVs. Both of these will now disappear on September 30th. What's it going to be like trying to buy an EV between now and then?
I think you're going to have a lot of competition. People, basically anyone who was thinking of buying an EV has a few months to get one before this credit goes away. So you're also going to see the automakers trying to sell as much of their inventory as they can, because that inventory is super sellable right now. You'll see this. You just look at who the major sellers are. They want to clear off inventory, because if they've got a lot of inventory left on October 1st, it's going to be harder to sell. So while there will be a lot of people wanting to buy EVs between now and then, there's a lot of vehicles out there. So I think people who want to buy before then will be able to do so.
Mm. And so who wanted to get rid of the EV tax credits? I don't think it was the car companies. Was it the oil industry, or was this more coming from Trump and the Republicans themselves?
There's like so many things. It's a bunch of different interconnected factors. The EV tax credit was very unpopular with a huge chunk of Republican members of Congress and a huge cohort of interest groups that lobby Congress. This will be a whole groups that are closely tied to the oil industry. Certainly, oil industry tied companies and organizations don't like the idea of making their competition more affordable. But as far as who the main drivers were of this, it was basically people who are against tax breaks, and especially against tax breaks that they perceive as unnecessary. There's this kind of stereotype of who the EV buyer is, and this stereotype of an affluent buyer and this is one that was very high on the list of things that were on the chopping block once President Trump was elected.
Mm. And so what does the big beautiful bill do to the Biden plan for supporting the build out of the EV charging infrastructure nationally?
Those tax credits, those will continue with much less modification than you see on so many other tax credits. So the manufacturing tax credits are they're not unscathed, but it's more of a flesh wound than than you see with things like the investment tax credit and the production tax credit for things like wind and solar. There will be a longer phase out, and the bigger concern is how the other parts of this bill and tariffs are going to affect demand for the things that these factories are producing. So if you have a battery factory, you may still get your tax credit for most of the duration of the time that you thought you were going to get it. But you now have new rules that there are tariffs for certain component parts. You have new rules that are limiting the use of components from China that are pretty vexing in terms of figuring out what the rules actually say and how to make sure that you comply. And now you have the loss of the consumer tax credits. That means you are undermining the demand for your product. So if you just built a battery factory and you spent billions upon billions of dollars to build it, you're going to fewer the line of customers to buy that product is going to be smaller, and it's going to take more years to develop. So it's so the bottom line is, your direct tax credits for the manufacturing, you're doing could have been a lot worse, but there's a whole bunch of other factors that are kind of causing some heartburn.
Yeah. So more broadly, what does the loss of the consumer tax credits and some of these manufacturing supports do to the competitiveness, the global competitiveness of the U.S. auto industry, particularly in its EV lines? We're seeing this incredible competition from the Chinese juggernaut, BYD. This can't be a good thing for the U.S. auto industry, is it?
If we're thinking of this in terms of what does the global auto industry look like in 2030 and 2040, this is utterly disastrous for that. So if I'm a US based auto company, if I am Ford, GM, um, this was an opportunity to make it easier to invest in technology. And you also have this brief moment, and it's not going to go on forever, but you have this moment that will last for, a few more years at least, where Chinese EVs are shut out of this market. So you don't have that competition. Um, the policies under the Biden administration, and there were policies before that too, were giving the opportunity for U.S. based automakers to catch up because China was ahead of the U.S. on this. And what you're seeing now is an attempt to basically win the race for the auto market as it existed in like 2010, maybe at some point in the past. Um, so it's not, you might win the battle for 2010, but you're going to get killed in the battle for 2030 and 2040. And that's just, I think the important thing to remember here, though, is that it's not like this legislation passed and we're all done. There will never be any policymaking in this front again. Things change. Things change. The automakers still have a lot of lobbying power. The battery makers have lobbying power. This country has a vested interest in having a large and profitable auto industry. And while this bill is in many ways a setback for that long-term future, we don't, we don't know what the long-term picture looks like.
Yeah. So let's talk about the greatest car company most Americans have never heard of, BYD, Build Your Dreams. This is a car company, the Chinese EV maker that can produce a pretty high quality car for under $10,000. It says it can charge a battery in 5 minutes. It's got an autonomous driving system that's as good and maybe even better than Tesla's. And the company is vertically integrated. So it makes all its own components, its own batteries, its own computer chips, its own software. It even owns interests in rare earth mineral mines, which is where it gets the raw materials for its batteries. And it's got ships that are now taking its cars all over the world. And if you travel around Europe or Asia right now, the odds are you're going to see Chinese BYD EVs all over the place. So let me ask you a really obvious question here, Dan. Why have Americans probably never heard of this company and certainly never seen a BYD car?
Trade policy. So it is prohibitive to sell a Chinese vehicle in several different ways. There have been policy decisions made, and this is not just a Republican thing. The Trump administration and the Biden administration I don't think there's that much daylight between them in terms of how much they wanted to keep Chinese cars out of the US. Because now a BYD vehicle in the US or other Chinese automakers, because there's several others, it would cost more. But it would be super inexpensive compared to the competing models. There's also it gets to be a pretty complicated hypothetical because now we have all of these tariffs on imported cars and tariffs on steel and all this stuff. But you would have a stream of high quality, more affordable vehicles, and that would be You think of just any business that kind of there's the product of the future, and then there's the products of the present and the products of the past. And you've seen the Chinese automakers get really good at making the products that for which the market is rapidly growing. And it would be what's more kind of scary from a US automaker's perspective is not where the Chinese automakers are now. It's the fact that they have this running start, that they have economies of scale, and where are they going to be in 5 years? And you look at how this bill kind of alters the incentives for US automakers. So, what are the US automakers? The US automakers that consider themselves global players, because the whole rest of the world is not doing what the US is doing in terms of policy. And they would like to sell cars in South America, Central America, Europe, China. They would like to sell cars in these other markets. It is, it's just, uh, it's not productive in terms of building a competitive US based auto industry for 2030. And it's just, and I imagine you look at improvements in battery quality, some of the vehicles coming out of China, in terms of battery ranges, in terms of quality issues, it's the US was getting to the point that it was jogging. It wasn't walking, it was kind of jogging, and there's a lot of ability in the US the US has a history of innovation in terms of its industrial output. Um, and this law is sending completely the wrong signal to those companies right now, and the companies know it too. And that's one of the things that's really challenging about this. You're not going to see the CEO of Ford or GM say this is just terrible because they don't want to earn the ire of the president. But it is, yeah. I mean, but what do? You just kind of try to persevere through this period.
Yeah, I think the CEO of Ford called BYD an existential threat, and I guess now even Toyota and the Japanese companies and the big European car companies like Volkswagen are worried about BYD.
Like the German companies are really interesting. I think, wait, it's this. There's a question of kind of is there a changing of the guard? I mean, we remember when Japanese companies came in with small cars, and it really exposed how the US companies had taken their eye off the ball. They had gotten really good at building a certain kind of car for a certain audience, and you had these companies like Honda, Toyota come in and really do an effective job of appealing to different segments of the market, appealing to more of a budget buyer with high quality vehicles. And it's like, I mean, I think, history does repeat itself. It's like, do we need to learn this lesson every 30 years or so? I don't know. But this is, yeah, this is this moment that we're going to go through. I would not count out the US automakers, but they know that they need to rapidly catch up. They are some of the best R&D minds in the world are working on this, are trying to, um, you know, be in position to be competitive. Because the alternative is, the US becoming kind of like a Cuba or something like that, where it's just like this weird backwater. And now that's an extreme example that is intended to be hyperbole, but it's and the automakers here know that if they become companies that get almost all their sales from selling in the US, and there's this whole other market with nicer vehicles everywhere else, it's just, you've kind of lost the game at that point.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you make a good point about, the resilience of our car companies and how smart they are in many ways. But at the same token, to think of them really sort of being saved by tariffs at this point it's kind of sobering. Um, I bought my first EV about a year ago. It's actually a plug-in hybrid. And as much as I loved sports cars back in the day, I gotta say, I think the electric driving experience is yeah, somewhat superior in many ways to the old internal combustion engine. And I really love not having to buy gas every week. So I got to ask you, what are you driving now?
So I have yet to get an EV. Right now, I'm driving a Honda CRV, and the CRV is actually made in Ohio. I'm based in Ohio. Um, I've been shopping. I want to get an EV, and there's this. I'm always keeping an eye on our household second vehicle is a Pontiac Vibe that is really old. It's time to replace it. And the question is, and we'd like to get an EV next. I just don't think this current window before the end of the tax credit is going to quite line up with when we would get it. But I look at the Chevrolet Equinox EV. Seems like a really nice vehicle. Before tariffs kind of really hurt its market, the Volvo EX30 looked like a really compelling vehicle. Those are two that I've really the Volkswagen ID4 was one that also um, tariff policy has just made it so much harder to shop for an EV, even aside from the tax credit changes. But yeah, it's I still hope and I still think that my next vehicle will be an EV. But this policy choices being made now are making that limiting the options and making that a more expensive choice.
Yeah. So what do you think the EV market in the US is going to look like in a year or two? Are EVs going to continue to be slowly capturing market share, or are they going to stall at some point, or as the world goes rapidly to EVs, or what do you see?
So, in the wake of this latest policy change, the major forecasters of this stuff have they either came out with numbers after this most recent legislation was signed or shortly before, anticipating it. And of course, the expectations for sales have gone down, gone down substantially, depending on who the forecaster is. But I would caution this is like when a major change is about to happen or has just happened, that's like about the worst time to make a forecast because you just don't know how all of the parties involved are going to respond. You don't know how the customer base, you don't know how the automakers, you don't know how everyone's going to respond to this change. We're also going to go through this weird time where EV sales are going to go way up this summer. And then they're going to drop off. And so what does that mean for 2025 sales in the US? I mean, forecasters will have a number, but will sales be up for the year as a whole with three fairly strong quarters? And then is 2026 going to be a down year? I think in the long run, the market will still continue to grow because there are a whole bunch of really compelling models. There are models that have been successful here even without qualifying for the 7,500 credit. Um, how much they'll go up, though, I just don't know. Um, but I think you can safely say that the EV market's going to grow a lot faster in the rest of the world. We're still less than 10% market share in the US. It's You're going to see Europe, China, of course, is already way ahead of that. You're the other major auto markets are it's going to be this strange kind of twilight zone moment where you can go to China and see the market of the future, and you can be in the US and see the market of the recent past. And it's like it's and I mean that's more if you in the next couple of years, I suspect. But all that said, I think that EV share is going to grow. It's just going to grow more slowly. And
Mm.
how much? There's also a possibility that just the product gets better, that companies find efficiencies, and then the policy could change again. This is always the thing that makes forecasting hard. The policies, just think of the craziness we've seen with wild gyrations in policy in the last 7 years or so. It's gonna, it is inevitable that the policies will change. It might change to make things more favorable or less favorable for electric vehicles, but that becomes very difficult to bake into questions of what this market will look like.
Yeah. So is Tesla, which has been our leading EV manufacturer for quite a few years, is Tesla in trouble?
So Tesla's sales are down. Tesla is by far the leading seller of EVs in the United States. It is still, despite losing some ground, it is still among the leaders in the world. Um, Yeah, Tesla has some real challenges. It also has some real advantages, though. There are aspects of the driver experience that they're really good at, in terms of some of the onboard electronics, in terms of just their battery, their whole process for building the next generation of vehicles. Um, it's like some of their recent missteps are kind of comical, but they are pretty good at this. Some aspects of this. Um, So I think, is Tesla in trouble? In some ways, Tesla is in trouble in almost a customer relations sense. They have a CEO who, in becoming closely associated with the Trump administration, alienated a significant share of the EV audience. Because the early adopters, eventually EVs are just going to be cars. We're not even going to say EVs, you're just going to say a car. But right now, we're still at a point where it's an EV as an alternative to a gas engine. And a disproportionate share of those customers are people who um, are not going to like some of the things that Elon Musk was doing in the Trump administration. So you're alienating a chunk of your customer base. A CEO should not alienate a significant share of your customer base. It's a bad idea unless you've got a whole bunch of like new customers just hanging out somewhere that are going to come back. So I guess the I gave you the long answer. The short answer is yes, Tesla's in trouble, but we don't know quite how much.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, one final question. I'm going to ask you to prognosticate here. 10 years from now, what percentage of the US car market is EVs, and what percentage of the global car market 10 years from now is EVs?
I can say with confidence that the global share is going to be higher than the US share. Um, so what percentage of the I mean, I think it'd be more than 30% in the US. I mean, there were some forecasts that that were getting into the nearly 40% um, by even 2030. So I think we can say safely more than 30%, but even that's a real guess. As far as what's the global share? I mean, the real number that will be fascinating, and it's the point at which the world has fundamentally changed, is when the percentage of new car sales crosses the 50% mark globally. When is that? I mean, that depends on a lot of things that are going to happen between now and then. But the totally like non-answer is I bet we're above 30%. Keep in mind we're less than 10% now. Um, but um, but the real answer is it depends on, and you could list a dozen different factors. It depends on how the companies respond to this moment. It also depends on how they respond to the next moment we haven't even thought about yet, because it just, it's like those specifics. But trade policy right now and kind of the policy coming out of the federal government is definitely an obstacle toward growing that share in the US.
Yeah, yeah. Dan, thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, thank you.
And thanks to all of you for watching, for reading, and for supporting our work at Inside Climate News.